We have always had two sexes.
But what about history? Just to pick history, not biology, because you said history, biology. What about history?
Well, there's a lot of history to biology, and you would be missing a big point to pretend that there's not historical biology. But if you want to talk about history, we can, not in biology, but just talk about the history of mankind.
Yeah.
We've got areas where they don't want to talk about slavery.
In today's video, David Pakman talks about Dr. Phil and calls him out for acting like right-wing supporter during a heated debate about cancel culture. Dr. Phil is very famous for his big TV talk show. He always says he doesn't care about politics and isn't political. But recently his actions are showing the opposite. For example, he even went to Donald Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden and attacked the Democratic Party. He said cancel culture is just another word for bullying. The problem is Dr. Phil talks a lot of opinions but doesn't really show any strong proof to back them up. That's where David Pakman comes in. He explains why Dr. Phil's arguments doesn't make sense and shows how weak they really are. So let's get into it and see how David Pakman completely exposes Dr. Phil in this heated debate.
We had one a group of people that wanted to start describing slavery in history books as involuntary relocation.
Right.
This was not involuntary relocation. This was slavery. And we've got people that are wanting to rename schools because people that were doing what were the mores and folkways of the times now would clearly be doing things against the law, certainly against mores and folkways, because they were slave owners at the time, are saying, well, now we have to tear down these statues, we have to rename these schools, and we don't want to teach about them. We have to learn from our mistakes as a society. We can't pretend those things didn't happen. They did happen. They were dark and ugly times in American history. We don't want to pretend those things weren't there.
So let me see if I understand, because there's a bunch of stuff. So if I hear you correctly, you're not in agreement with those who want to minimize the tragedy and brutality of slavery, but you also want to keep the school names. If a school is named after a slave owner, you're also okay with that because it will remind us and we will learn from it. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think you're oversimplifying what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if you're wanting to change American history to pretend that these people did not exist, and you want to measure them by today's yardstick rather than the yardstick at the time, that's what is referred to as presentism. And that's like saying, okay, you're going to drive through a neighborhood and the speed limit is 20. And you drive through that neighborhood doing 20, and then they come along and say, you know what, we're going to change the speed limit to 10. And we're going to give you a ticket for speeding when the speed limit was 20. It's now 10, but you weren't speeding when you were doing 20, but now it's 10. We're going to give you a retroactive ticket for doing what was acceptable at the time. That's called presentism. We're going to take what was done back at the time, pull it up into the current time, and condemn you for not knowing what was going to be acceptable 200 years later than when you did it. And I think that is really narcissistic and arrogant and rewriting history instead of letting people learn from the mistakes that were made in America and that we need to learn from so we don't make those mistakes again. Because some of those people also did some really good things at the time. We don't need to endorse everything they did, but we need to acknowledge the good and the bad.
Now, Dr. Phil says that removing the names of slave owners from schools or building is like rewriting history. But David Pakman disagrees. He explains that changing a name is not erasing history. It's about who we choose to honor. Nobody is trying to hide that slavery happened. People are just saying we should not celebrate those who owned slaves. For example, we all learn about Hitler and the Holocaust in school. But you don't see schools in Germany named after Hitler. That doesn't mean they are ignoring history. It means they don't want to glorify someone who caused so much pain. Dr. Phil thinks that taking down statues or remaining schools will make people forget history. But that's not true. Removing a statue doesn't erase someone from the history book. Everyone will still learn about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, even if their names aren't on a school building anymore. And here is another important point. Keeping those names can feel very disrespectful, especially to black students who have to study in a school named after someone who would have enslaved their ancestors. If changing a school name makes the community more respectful and inclusive, how can that be a bad thing?
When it comes to cancel culture, something you've also written and spoken about, what do you think is the prototypical or emblematic example of someone who was unfairly canceled over the last few years?
Well, I think the idea of cancel culture is more than one person, and I'm not going to speak specifically about one person. What I'm going to say is you've got people that want their speech instead of free speech. And so they will come in and talk about in a university certain things that can't be shared, can't be talked about. We've got universities that have put out language that they highly recommend their professors to not use. One of them that jumps out at me from the University of California is they were encouraged to no longer say America is the land of opportunity, or the job should go to the most qualified person. They were saying you can't say those things anymore because they are considered to be oppressive. And if you have university faculty, even tenured faculty, that talk about those things or ask their students to take positions that are contrary to what they believe, what the students believe, they get grieved against, they get suspended, they get disciplined, and in a sense canceled at that point.
You know, that's interesting. Let me weigh in on that a little bit because that's very interesting. You know, in preparation for the interview, I looked at the academic setting because a lot of times when we talk about cancellation, we talk about, oh, a comedian who said or did something and then for a while they didn't have shows or something like that, you know, Louis C.K., for example, et cetera. I looked for the revocation of tenure for professors in a lot of these schools that you talk about or allude to. And really, it seems that when tenure is being stripped, it's for real wrongdoing. Plagiarism is uncovered, sexual harassment of students, etc. I really struggle to find evidence in a country of 330 million people of tenure being stripped just because of using the wrong language. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't wacky memos that go out, or I'm with you that this stuff exists anecdotally. But if we think about what is happening big picture, I actually struggle to really find examples of this as an epidemic. Tell me where I may be missing something.
Well, I don't know what you mean by epidemic.
Well, that it's happening, that professors are being stripped of tenure, not for serious violations of their like I said, sexual harassment, plagiarism, being involved in criminality, but just because they said something that is maybe not politically correct. I'm just not seeing that tenure is being stripped from professors for that. Do you have any examples of professors that have lost tenure in that way?
I do, and I'll provide it to you. How's that? I'll get you a list and send it to you.
That would be, I would love to do that, because if that is happening, I want to expose that, and I want to talk about that.
It's actually pretty funny when David Pakman asked Dr. Phil to give real examples of professor losing tenure just for saying something politically incorrect. But Dr. Phil cannot name a single one. Instead, he says he will send a list later, which feels like he is just dodging the question. And Pakman points out the facts. When professor lose tenure, it's usually for serious reasons like plagiarism, sexual harassment, or even crime, not just for sharing an opinion. And remember, tenure itself was created to protect professors' freedom of speech. So the idea that universities are taking it away just because of one controversial comment doesn't really make sense. And about the claim that students cannot handle different opinions, that's also exaggerated. Survey shows most college students actually support free speech and open debate. They just want professors to create a respectful classroom for everyone. That is not cancel culture. That's just basic respect. At the end of the day, there is no big proof of professors being fired simply for speaking their minds. Cancel culture might sound huge in headlines, but Pakman shows the reality is much smaller than Dr. Phil makes it seem. So that is for today. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like and subscribe and share your thoughts in the comment. I would really like to know, and I read every single comments you guys did in the comment section. So thanks for watching.